Case 1. Sam Cooke. No one in the music world could have predicted that one of the most beloved and influential voices of the 20th century would die half-dressed on the cold floor of a cheap Los Angeles motel. Yet just after 2 a.m. on December 11, 1964, that is exactly how police found Sam Cooke inside the office of the Hacienda Motel, lying on his back, a bullet hole in his chest, wearing nothing but a sports jacket and a single shoe. Motel manager Bertha Franklin stood nearby, a gun still in her hand, insisting that Cooke had burst through the door, enraged and demanding the whereabouts of a missing woman. Within hours, authorities issued a ruling that stunned fans. Justifiable homicide. Case closed. But for those who loved Sam Cooke, the story never made sense. Before that tragic night, Cooke's rise was almost mythical. Born into a gospel family, his voice transformed the Soul Stirrers into one of the most dynamic groups in sacred music history. When he crossed over into pop, he reshaped American sound with smooth vocals and socially conscious songwriting. You Send Me, Chain Gang, and A Change Is Gonna Come not only climbed charts, they defined eras, movements, and dreams. He was handsome, confident, and on the verge of founding his own independent label. Sam Cooke was not a fading star with nothing to lose. He was a man positioned to control his career in a way black artists rarely could at the time. That is what makes his final hours so disturbing. The official version tells a story of a drunken argument with a woman named Elisa Boyer, whom Cooke had met earlier that night. Boyer told police she fled their motel room, believing she was in danger, taking Cooke's clothing with her. Cooke, wearing only his jacket and one shoe, allegedly burst into the manager's office demanding to know where Boyer had gone. Moments later, Franklin claimed she shot him in self-defense. But almost instantly, details fell apart. Witness accounts contradicted each other. Why was Boyer's testimony accepted at face value when it changed multiple times? Why were Cooke's wallet and personal items reportedly missing? Why did police refuse to pursue further questioning related to his business affairs, record ownership disputes, or contracts? Why were certain investigative documents sealed? For many, especially within black communities, the ruling felt suspiciously fast and conveniently simple. Civil suits followed, but none ever forced a full, public accounting of what happened inside that motel. Conspiracy theories persist. Was Cooke targeted because of his push for artist ownership? Was there a robbery setup involved? Did someone want him silenced before he controlled too much of his own music revenue? 60 years later, one haunting truth remains. Sam Cooke, a musical revolutionary on the edge of a new beginning, died in circumstances so confused and poorly explained that no definitive answer has ever surfaced. The final minutes of his life are still a fog of unanswered questions, leaving fans with a painful mystery. How does a man whose voice changed everything lose his life in one of the most confusing motel incidents in music history, and no one ever gives a straight answer? If you're still here, you already feel it. That combination of curiosity, outrage, and heartbreak that surrounds some of the most important voices in gospel, R&B, and black music history. Welcome to Savage Case Files, where we dig beneath the headlines, beneath the official rulings, and beneath the convenient explanations to uncover the stories rarely given the time they deserve. Every episode is researched, narrated, and produced with one goal: to preserve truth, to honor legacy, and to ask the questions others stopped asking decades ago. If you believe these artists deserve more than silence and mystery, subscribe right now. Your support keeps this channel alive, keeps us digging for facts, and helps bring more long-form storytelling every single day to people who refuse to let these stories disappear. Case 2, Reverend James Cleveland. Rev. James Cleveland's death in February 1991 sent a shockwave through the gospel world. But what stunned people even more was how quickly the official narrative closed, almost as if someone slammed a door shut. The man known as the King of Gospel Music died at home in Los Angeles from what was ruled natural causes, heart failure complicated by respiratory issues. Yet from the very moment the news broke, there were whispers, sealed documents, and questions that never stopped circulating. Cleveland had been the voice behind some of the greatest mass choirs ever assembled, a bridge between the hymns of the old church and the contemporary sound that defined modern gospel. He founded the Gospel Music Workshop of America, mentored countless singers, produced legendary albums, and traveled the world as the trusted father figure of a movement. But behind the stadium concerts, Grammy Awards, and Sunday Best glamour, there was a private man whose final months became shrouded in secrecy. When he became ill, only a very small circle had access to him. Friends and fellow musicians remember calls going unanswered, hospital visits denied, and information filtered through only 2 or 3 people close to him. When he died, his death certificate listed heart failure, but that was where the transparency seemed to end. The strange part wasn't that he died, he was struggling with health issues for years, but the silence that followed. Medical records associated with his passing were sealed, sparking rumors and disputes that lingered for decades. People who worked with Cleveland said conversations about his final days provoked emotional reactions and sudden refusals to talk. Some family members and former associates clashed in legal settings over access, privacy, and control of information. Others claimed that parts of his medical history were intentionally hidden to protect his reputation and safeguard the gospel industry from scandal. But no one ever fully explained why death records for one of the most public figures in gospel history had to be locked away. Even now, among musicians who came up through the Gospel Music Workshop, Cleveland's final chapter is something spoken about in fragments, never clearly, never fully, always with careful wording. "There is information we'll never get," one veteran choir director said years after the fact. They didn't want the truth to become the headline. That kind of sentence, half true and half speculation, followed Cleveland everywhere after he was buried. The unanswered question remains painfully simple, but maddeningly elusive. Why did those around him go to such lengths to keep details about his final illness private? Was it merely an attempt to protect a legacy, or did they fear public backlash, lawsuits, financial fallout, or media exploitation? Did they worry that the gospel world, already struggling with scandals in the early 90s, would lose one of its most untouchable icons in a cloud of controversy? Rather than celebration, more than 30 years later, listeners can still play "I Don't Feel No Ways Tired," "Lord, Do It," or "God Has Smiled on Me," and be swept back into a voice that shaped generations. Yet hovering over that voice is a permanent shadow, a story that ends not with closure, but with sealed files, quiet settlements, and speculation that refuses to stop. In life, James Cleveland built transparency through music. In death, he became one of the most mysterious figures in gospel history, a contradiction that defines his legacy as much as the songs he left behind. Case 3. Thomas Whitfield. There is a particular sadness in the way Thomas Whitfield's story is remembered, because unlike some legends whose final days were surrounded by spectacle or scandal, his departure came quietly, abruptly, and with almost no public explanation. He was at home in Detroit on November 21, 1992, a Saturday night like any other, when the man the gospel world called the Maestro simply slipped away. The official cause of death was listed as respiratory failure, but that phrase barely scratches the surface of what made his passing feel so mysterious. There were no warning interviews hinting at illness, no paparazzi surveillance, no dramatic hospitalization. One moment he was one of gospel's greatest arrangers and architects of the modern choir sound, and the next, news spread through church networks and radio stations that Thomas Whitfield, at just 38 years old, was gone. To understand why his death still generates unanswered questions decades later, you first have to understand who he was while he lived. Whitfield was not a flashy celebrity or tabloid figure. He was a musical perfectionist, a studio revolutionary who layered harmonies and orchestration long before gospel labels invested in those kinds of production techniques. He nurtured choirs, composed songs that became Sunday morning standards, and inspired the next generation of gospel producers. His peers respected him not just as a singer, but as a genius arranger who could take a simple worship refrain and turn it into a masterpiece. He was meticulous, reserved, intensely private, and perhaps that is part of why the suddenness of his death hit so hard. People assumed someone with that much discipline, creativity, and drive must surely have decades left to shape the sound of gospel music. The mystery begins in the silence. Respiratory failure can have many medical causes: infection, heart complications, sleep apnea, embolism, but very little was ever shared publicly. No detailed medical timeline, no interview from a doctor, no public statement from family explaining his health condition. Fans and fellow musicians were left with an official ruling and nothing else. And that vacuum created a cloud of speculation that never really settled. Was there an underlying condition he kept private? Was it something that could have been treated? Did stress, studio exhaustion, or long sleepless nights building choir arrangements wear his body down without anyone noticing? Thomas Whitfield was working, touring, producing, pouring himself into music at an intense pace in the final months of his life. And that pace, some believe, must have taken a toll. The aftermath was heartbreaking, because no one was prepared for a future without him. Choirs who depended on his direction scrambled to finish projects he left unfinished. Younger musicians suddenly lost their mentor. Gospel radio stations aired tribute marathons, but even in the tributes, there was a tone of disbelief. How could a man who seemed so controlled and so committed to excellence vanish without warning? Unlike heart attacks, car crashes, or public medical battles, Whitfield's death did not give people a narrative they could make sense of. It gave them a question mark. And that question mark still sits there, 3 decades later, every time one of his arrangements lifts a church to its feet. Thomas Whitfield's genius changed gospel forever. But the details of his final night, what exactly caused his lungs to fail, what he felt, what he knew, whether anything could have been different, are still unknown. In the world of music, sometimes the greatest mysteries come not from scandal, but from silence. Case 4, James Moore. The last weeks of James Moore's life never made sense to the people closest to him. One moment he was preparing for another round of concerts and ministry appearances, the voice still rich enough to peel paint off church walls, and the next, he was sliding into a medical decline so rapid that even his doctors struggled to explain it. Moore had been open about battling diabetes, but those who saw him in late spring of 2000 said he was still pushing through, still planning, still working on music that he hoped would reignite a new season of worship. Then, suddenly, almost without warning, everything changed. Friends recall phone calls filled with worry, late-night pleas for prayer, and a sudden shift from touring schedules to hospital rooms. What seemed like routine treatment quickly turned into whispered questions. Why was his condition deteriorating so fast, and why did no one seem to have a clear medical explanation for what was happening? He was admitted for complications related to diabetes, yet the speed of his decline stunned even those familiar with the disease. Nurses and family described his body simply giving out, as if some unseen switch had been flipped. The official ruling would eventually be natural causes tied to diabetes complications, but that explanation never fully satisfied the people who watched the gradual, then sudden, unraveling of a man whose voice had been synonymous with strength. Moore had sung about endurance, faith, and pushing through darkness, yet in the end his final days were marked by confusion more than clarity. Fans were left grieving not only the loss of a gospel icon, but the nagging feeling that more was going on medically than was ever publicly revealed. In the aftermath, rumors swirled around unanswered questions. Did the treatment come too late? Was there an underlying condition that wasn't disclosed? Why did his health collapse so abruptly after years of managing illness? And why, to this day, is there so little publicly detailed medical information about the final 72 hours of his life? His funeral drew choirs, pastors, and musicians from across the country who spoke of his generosity, his dramatic tenor power, and the unmistakable fire in his music. But even as they honored him, many privately admitted they still didn't understand what really happened behind closed doors. James Moore's legacy remains secure in gospel history, but the story of how he left this world remains one of gospel's quietest, most heartbreaking mysteries. A voice silenced too soon, and a medical narrative that never quite added up. Case 5. LaShun Pace. LaShun Pace spent a lifetime pouring out gospel fire with a voice that could shake walls, but her final years unfolded like a chain of heartbreaks no one outside her family fully understood. She was in and out of hospitals in Atlanta, posting moments of faith and worship even from a sickbed, refusing to let her suffering silence her praise. The official cause of death listed kidney failure, but anyone who followed her story knows that long before her body gave out, tragedy had been eating away at her spirit. Family losses, health scares, and quiet battles piled up behind the scenes. Gospel fans only saw her on stage, smiling through those impossibly high runs, unaware of the long-term medical complications slowly tightening around her life. The mystery surrounding LaShun's death isn't about conspiracy, it's about questions that never received clear answers. After years of candid posts about her struggles, her passing on March 21, 2022 still arrived with a feeling of shock. She had fought through so much already. There were whispers in gospel circles that stress had been her silent killer. Years before she died, she buried her daughter, a tragedy so devastating that many close to her said she never fully recovered. Friends noticed a shift: occasional disappearances from public life, uneven concert schedules, and long periods of rest that were never fully explained. It wasn't one event. It was accumulation, layer upon layer of pain. When news broke that she had died in an Atlanta hospital, the reaction was immediate and raw. Gospel singers, choirs, and fans created a digital chorus of memorials. But just beneath the grief was a shared question. How did someone so strong, so spiritually resilient, reach such a sudden decline? They knew about kidney complications, but serious medical details were never made public. Was it a long-term illness worsened by emotional trauma? Was it delayed treatment? Was it simply a body worn out after decades of pushing through pain to minister to others? In many ways, the unanswered questions around LaShun Pace's death mirror the tone of her music. Deeply emotional, unresolved, always reaching for something just beyond human understanding. Her sisters in the Anointed Pace family later reminded fans that she had been fighting health issues for years, but no one could explain with precision why her condition became fatal when it did. That ambiguity opened space for speculation, not sensationalism, but reflection. Did the gospel industry do enough to support one of its legends as she slowly faded from view? Did the weight of ministry expectations contribute to a decline no one truly noticed until it was too late? In the end, all we know for certain is this: LaShun Pace left this world after a lifetime of worship, loved by millions but surrounded by questions about the toll of suffering, grief, and silence. She died in a hospital bed, but the story of her passing remains unfinished. One more gospel mystery where the truth sits just beneath what was officially written on paper. Case 6. Keith Wonderboy Johnson. Keith Wonderboy Johnson spent 3 decades building a reputation as one of gospel's most reliable voices in quartet music, the soulful bridge between the old-school sound of church trios and the modern energy of contemporary praise. He was only 50 years old when he died in September 2022. And the shock that followed wasn't rooted in scandal or controversy, but in the eerie silence surrounding how quickly it all happened. In the days leading up to his passing, Johnson was still booking dates, posting videos, and entertaining fans with that unmistakable growl in his voice. Nothing seemed wrong, at least nothing that the public could see. But on one quiet Friday afternoon, family members found him unresponsive at his home, and the news spread with the kind of disbelief that only comes when a voice everyone assumed would be around for decades simply fades out. The official early reports used a familiar phrase, medical cause not disclosed. No immediate medical explanation, no public emergency record, no statement of long-term illness, just a sudden, unexpected death. For fans and fellow gospel musicians, that absence of detail became its own mystery. How does someone so deeply embedded in touring, ministry, and community life suddenly disappear without warning? Within days, social media was flooded with tributes, but also quiet questions. Johnson had always been relatively private about his health, never broadcasting aches, struggles, or concerns. That silence made the announcement feel even more jarring. Rumors surfaced, as they always do, but none ever evolved into clear answers. What made the uncertainty especially haunting was the contrast between Johnson's personality and the questions surrounding his final hours. He was known for joy, the kind that got people out of their seats even in small churches and afternoon anniversaries. His songs weren't polished studio ballads designed for radio. They were heartbeat rhythms, hand claps, and gritty lead vocals meant to hit the soul. Let go and let God have his way, hide behind the mountain, and I'll fly away became Sunday morning standards. Even if listeners didn't know his name, they knew his voice. That familiarity made it impossible to imagine gospel programs, award shows, and homegoing celebrations without him. In the days after his passing, industry veterans began to reflect not just on the loss, but on how fragile the gospel world can be when legends leave without explanation. Was there an underlying condition? Did he know something was wrong and choose to keep it private? Could stress, constant travel, and the demands of ministry have caught up? These questions lingered throughout the community, because no definitive, publicly documented cause of death was shared. As weeks became months, the story transitioned from breaking news into a quiet ache, one of those tragedies that feels unfinished. Today, Keith Wonderboy Johnson's music plays on broadcast radio and local church anniversary programs like nothing ever happened, which, in a way, deepens the mystery. His voice moves across sanctuaries with life and energy, even though no one outside his inner circle truly knows what ended it. And that is the lasting question that hangs in the air whenever someone mentions him. How can someone with so much left to sing simply be gone, without even a single clear explanation of why? Case 7. Rance Allen. Rance Allen spent his entire life lifting people to their feet with that unmistakable voice, a voice that could leap from a growling baritone to a sky-high falsetto in a single breath. By the time he reached his late 60s, he was a respected bishop, a Grammy nominee, and a beloved pioneer who helped bridge traditional black gospel with the soulful sound of R&B. That's why the announcement of his death in October 2020 stunned the gospel world. Not just because of the loss, but because of how little anyone knew about what had actually happened. The official statement said he died from complications related to a medical procedure, but no further details were released. No hospital name, no public medical timeline. Just a vague phrase that raised more questions than answers. For someone so publicly loved, the privacy surrounding his final days has become part of the mystery. The official story is that Allen underwent a procedure family representatives never specified whether it was cardiac, respiratory, orthopedic, or related to another condition, and he didn't recover from the complications afterward. That's common enough in older patients, but the lack of information immediately led people to wonder what went wrong. Why wasn't there even a basic explanation? Why were family members and management so tight-lipped? Gospel fans had grown up watching Rance on stage, sweating through three-piece suits, shouting mid-song improvisations, and delivering those unbelievable vocal runs that could silence a room. For many, it felt like someone had closed a door on the last chapter of his story and refused to explain what was behind it. People close to Alan described him as strong, active, and still performing before his death, which only deepened the confusion. He had recently appeared in church panels, recorded interviews, and participated in online services during the pandemic. He seemed tired, but not visibly frail. Then suddenly he was gone, with a one-sentence announcement telling fans only that complications from a procedure had taken him. As tributes poured in, from Kirk Franklin to the Winans family to everyday churchgoers who remembered the first time they heard something about the name Jesus, conversations quietly shifted from grief to curiosity. Was this a routine medical appointment that spiraled out of control? Was it a surgery that carried known risks? If complications were involved, what were they? Of course, the Allen family had every right to guard their privacy, especially in a time of loss. But secrecy can create a vacuum, and in that space, people inevitably fill the silence with speculation. Was there a misdiagnosis? Did doctors miss something critical? Was COVID involved? The official statements never answered these questions. Even today, fans revisit that announcement and wonder why a legend, someone who gave nearly 50 years to gospel music, someone whose voice shaped entire generations, left this world with so little clarity surrounding his final moments. Rance Allen's legacy isn't defined by mystery, but by music. Still, the lack of transparency turned his death into an unsolved chapter in the history of gospel. One voice, one life, one final procedure, and no clear answers. Now the mystery left behind is simple and haunting. What exactly went wrong when the man with a supernatural voice went in for a medical procedure and never came home? Case 8. Willie Banks. There are some gospel deaths that feel like a final chapter written with clarity, dates, medical records, statements, and closure. Willie Banks's passing is not one of them. He was a pillar of traditional gospel, a Mississippi son whose voice could split a room wide open and make even the most hardened skeptic feel like they'd been transported back to a shouting tent revival. Banks lived on the road. His life was motel rooms, church basements, and Friday night quartet concerts that stretched into early Sunday morning worship services. But when news broke in 1993 that he had died from natural causes, there was a strange hush in the gospel world. A silence not just from grief, but curiosity, because to this day there is surprisingly little public documentation about exactly where Banks was in his final hours, what medical challenges were present, who was with him, or how it all unfolded. Friends and musicians who toured with him remembered that he seemed tired during the last stretch of performances, but there were no widespread reports of illness or major medical crises leading up to the moment. He wasn't in and out of hospitals for prolonged treatment, and no high-profile gospel publications offered detailed obituaries beyond short memorial announcements. In a world where other gospel legends had newspaper tributes, archives, and carefully reported timelines of their final weeks, Banks's passing seemed almost swallowed whole by the industry he helped build. There was no large-scale funeral broadcast, no public health disclosure, no family press statement laying out events. What existed instead were dozens of whispered recollections, stories passed from singer to singer backstage, and a general feeling of unease that so little was known beyond the official line. Willie Banks died. That was it. Natural causes. Case closed. A major part of the mystery comes from the fact that Banks had one of the most recognizable and emotionally raw voices in gospel, yet, unlike singers with major record label contracts, he lived a more grounded life, closer to the grassroots heart of the genre. He didn't always have a PR machine or media team shaping his public narrative. which means the archive of his final days simply doesn't exist in a transparent form. It leaves unanswered questions. Was there a sudden medical event that no one recognized in time? Had he been quietly battling health concerns that only close family knew about? Why wasn't there a more detailed obituary, interview, or retrospective addressing the circumstances of his passing? And for many longtime fans, the haunting part isn't how he died, but the fact that so little documentation was kept for one of gospel's most influential male vocalists. It becomes a broader question. How many stories get lost because the artists who built gospel music did so in community spaces rather than corporate ones? Because the industry wasn't treating Black gospel history as something worth preserving in real time? Willie Banks left behind a legacy of raw, unapologetic praise and recordings that continue to circulate from hand to hand, choir to choir. But his death remains one of gospel's quiet puzzles. No conspiracy, no dramatic revelation, just too many blanks in the timeline, too much silence where testimony should have been. And when you look back at the man and the voice, that silence feels strangely out of tune, like a missing note in a closing chorus that should have been sung loud enough for everyone to hear. Case 9. Albertina Walker. Albertina Walker's death in 2010 should have been a straightforward moment of mourning, a celebrated gospel matriarch passing quietly after decades of service to the music she helped shape. Instead, what followed was a confusing fog of partial information and unanswered questions. What the public was told sounded simple: respiratory failure, complications related to illness, a transition that happened after hospitalization in Chicago. But almost immediately, there were whispers among gospel insiders that something about the timeline didn't add up. She had been performing, attending events, and even planning future work just months before, with no clear indications that her health was nearing crisis. Then, suddenly, she disappeared from public view, admitted to the hospital, and news of her condition became scarce. Statements from family and associates were respectful but vague, leaving admirers wondering what really happened in those final days. Walker's influence in gospel music is nearly impossible to measure. Dubbed the Queen of Gospel, she founded the Caravans, mentored Shirley Caesar, Dorothy Norwood, Inez Andrews, Dolores Washington, and dozens of others who would define an entire era of the traditional gospel sound. Her career lasted across generations, from storefront churches in Chicago to national television appearances and awards ceremonies. Yet when she died, the narrative almost instantly shifted from celebration to speculation. Respiratory failure can be triggered by countless underlying issues: infection, pulmonary disease, cardiac complications, long-term untreated illness, or even surgical procedures gone wrong. But none of those specifics were immediately shared, and even months later, many details remained private. Those who knew her closely have suggested that she'd been battling health issues quietly for years, choosing privacy over public worry. Others say the decision to withhold medical information came from a place of dignity, protecting a gospel icon from tabloids and sensational headlines. But the unanswered question still lingers. What was the full medical timeline before Albertina Walker's death? Gospel historians often mention how quickly the public announcements came. First, that she had been hospitalized, then almost immediately that she had passed, with little clarity in between. Even well-regarded media outlets repeated the same phrases without further explanation, which only deepened curiosity. There was another layer, too: legacy protection. Some within her circle were determined that Walker be remembered for the music, not the mystery. They kept updates minimal, focusing on tributes rather than medical facts. The result is a strange silence around the final chapter of someone who always lived loudly in song, community, and worship. Her funeral drew celebrities, clergy, choirs, and city officials. Streets closed, churches overflowed. Chicago honored her as one of its greatest cultural treasures. Yet despite the public celebration of her life, the private circumstances of her death remain largely sealed in family memory. To this day, when fans talk about Albertina Walker, the conversation usually returns to the music, the mentorship, and the voice that sounded like Sunday morning blended with fire. But behind that respect sits a lingering question mark. Not scandalous, just human. What really happened in her final days? And why was so little said about a life that had given so much to gospel music? Case 10. Mahalia Jackson. When Mahalia Jackson died on January 27, 1972, it felt impossible that the most powerful gospel voice in American history could simply fall silent without warning. She had been planning tours, discussing her next recordings, and writing letters about future ministry itineraries. Unlike many celebrity deaths, there was no dramatic crash, no public scandal, no hospital photo circulated to the press, only a brief announcement that she had passed away in a Chicago hospital from heart failure brought on by diabetes complications. The official story was clean, clinical, and unemotional. But beneath that tidy line item lay a series of unanswered questions that still linger among fans, choir directors, and researchers of gospel history. Everyone who knew Mahalia understood two truths. She lived a life of constant travel and relentless speaking engagements, and she did it under enormous spiritual and emotional pressure. She wasn't just a singer. She was the international ambassador of gospel music. She sang at Dr. King's funeral, performed at the March on Washington, and carried the music of the Black church into the global mainstream. Yet the grind of touring and ministering through the civil rights era came with a private cost. Friends later said she rarely rested, rarely took a break, and rarely slowed down long enough to recover between trips. By the late 1960s, her doctors were urging her to pull back on travel, but Mahalia insisted she had a calling, and calling always came before caution. When she was admitted to the hospital in late 1971, very little information was made public. There were whispers of complications, mentions of diabetes, and notes about swelling and exhaustion. But the full medical timeline was never revealed. No formal press briefing, no detailed physician statement, just scattered comments to the effect that her body could no longer keep up with her spirit. Even journalists found it strange that a woman of her fame received so little disclosed information surrounding her final days. Some insiders later wondered if repeated, untreated stress had pushed her body further into crisis. Others speculated over long-term health problems that were never fully shared with the public. Mahalia was only 60 years old. For someone still planning tours, rehearsing music, and publicly proclaiming future projects, the abruptness of her death felt like a story with missing pages. Why was the hospitalization kept quiet until after her passing? Were there complications that the family chose not to disclose? Was it exhaustion layered on top of chronic illness that the public never saw? Or was it something simpler? A legend finally succumbing to decades of overwork in service to a ministry that asked everything of her. The truth may be buried in medical files, personal journals, or private family conversations, but the mystery remains part of her legacy. The Queen of Gospel left this world while still preparing for her next stage. One day she was mapping out routes on a calendar. The next day, the world woke up to find the greatest gospel voice of the 20th century gone, leaving behind a question no hospital record ever fully answered. Did Mahalia Jackson die from illness alone, or from a lifetime spent lifting others at the cost of herself? Some mysteries bleed into silence. Others refuse to rest, echoing through documentaries, whispered stories in choirs, and late-night conversations in churches where these artists were once household names. 10 legends, 10 funerals, 10 unanswered questions that linger not because we demand conspiracies, but because pieces of truth were scattered, sealed away, or never recorded at all. These were voices that shifted gospel, soul, and black music forever. Yet when it came time to leave this world, many of their departures were framed by confusion. The Hacienda Motel police file, the sealed medical records in Los Angeles, sudden respiratory failures with no public explanation, a gospel pioneer dying mid-Mother's Day tour, a beloved trio member taken by a silent pandemic, a choir icon lost without warning in the night. Over and over, the pattern repeats: fame, glory, ministry, music, and then a final chapter written by shock, hesitation, unanswered questions, and lingering grief, in communities that still play their songs today. And that's the unspoken tragedy buried beneath these stories. We mourn the loss, yes, but we also mourn what we'll never know. The final conversations that were never recorded, the final phone calls that never made headlines, the last doctor's report kept in a file cabinet, the last moments alone in a hospital room, a hotel room, a quiet bedroom somewhere far from the stage lights. We celebrate the legacies, but their deaths remind us that even the brightest voices can leave this world carrying secrets no one hears until it's too late. Mystery, in this context, isn't entertainment. It's a reminder that Black artists, especially in gospel and soul, often suffered in silence, protected by families, managers, and systems that offered closure without clarity. So now we turn it over to you. Which story in this list hit you hardest, and which mystery do you believe still deserves answers? Was it Sam Cooke's Motel Chaos? Reb James Cleveland's sealed records? Keith Wonderboy Johnson's sudden loss? Or Mahalia Jackson's unexplained decline at just 60 years old? Drop your thoughts, theories, and memories in the comments below. Share your personal stories. The concerts you attended, the records you inherited, the songs that carried your family through grief. Because sometimes the truth lives in the community more than in official files. If you want more long-form, research-driven storytelling like this, deep dives into gospel legends, hidden histories, and mysteries the mainstream overlooks, subscribe to Savage Case Files right now. Your engagement is what keeps these stories alive. Your support makes it possible to bring you new investigations every single day. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and thank you for caring enough to keep asking questions long after the final track fades.